All right, check one, check two. All right, check's good. Sorry, I'm messing with the microphone. Here we go. I was going to call this series, this is episode 52 of the 40 Ounce Hemlock podcast. Okay. I was going to call this series that I guess we've embarked on, I was going to call it Mind the Gap. Because it's about the gap between, or rather the gap that the mind poses for us or presents to us in trying to understand our place in the world, or act like we're trying to understand our place in the world, or knowledge, or knowledge of the world, and so forth. But if you're not aware of that gap, it's because of another gap. So that gap, this other gap, there's a couple gaps. The chasm, the gulf between what modern media and the pseudo intellectuals who sort of support them and animate their world try to tell you about our knowledge of the nature of the human mind. The gap between that, like what they tell you, and the actual truth of things in that area. There's a big gap there. And truth about what? Truth about whether it be intellectual history or truth in terms of the current state of the literature and arguments about those topics. Things in the philosophy of science, philosophy of religion, all things like this. Anything related to the mind especially. All right, so that's why it was going to be called Mind the Gap. Maybe it should be called Mind the Gaps. There's layers to this. There's levels to this, I should say. It's layered like that. Anyway, I know as far as the YouTube thing, we've only talked about like 10 seconds of this clip so far. I began with this discussion of the idea of polarization and how polarized we are, and we talked about that last time. So I want to get into like the meat of this now, but to get into the meat of it, I'm going to have to sort of like explain what the meat consists in, okay? And I think I'm going to call this episode an introduction to neuropolitics. Yeah, let me say it again. An introduction to neuropolitics. And then the next episode will be an introduction to neuropolitics. Okay, I know that sounds highfalutin. I know it sounds cryptic. I know it's however it sounds. Just bear with me. I talk a lot about the mind. Okay, why the mind? Why this series? As far as the podcast goes, why this series called Mind the Gap? Why all the other discussions of the mind in the other podcasts and the other shows? Two reasons, at least here for now. There's two reasons. One is that there is this standard story that you're taught if you're an educated person. In fact, it's almost just the case that the mark of an educated person, quote unquote, in our culture is to believe this story. And then the question is, well, what's that story? Well, here's the story. And if you don't recognize this as a story, it might be because this is a story you've been told. So you see, okay, sometimes we're like, well, that's not a story, that's the truth. Yep, hold on. So would say the person who's been told the story and believes it, right? So the story goes something like this. In the ancient world, when we didn't really understand what things were and what reality was, and we were a little bit more naive than we are now. Fruit fly, please don't fly in my beer. In the olden days, right, as we used to say as kids, in the ancient days, man was sort of like believed that whatever he was sort of like part mind and part body, or part flesh and part spirit. And the world too was sort of like part material and part like immaterial. There was things that you can't poke or touch or burn or hear, or what are the other senses? Sorry, I'm blanking out. There's things that you can sense, and there's things that you can't sense with the five senses, but some of those things are still real, like that line in Shakespeare, there's more under heaven and earth, right? That idea. Whatever there is, there's more than just material stuff. So the story goes, in the ancient world, they believed this sort of like twofold thing, this sort of dual thing, mind and body, flesh and spirit. And they believed that humans had a soul or an immaterial spirit or something like that, and then a physical body, right? And the world itself was sort of like this material thing, but it was animated in some ways or attached to certain like objective values and mathematical principles that aren't obviously or even conceivably material themselves, and yet they exist, right? Because we're doing math and we're doing science. So the ancients believed all this. The story goes. And then, so goes the story, we figured out in like the 1700s, or the 1600s, 1700s, late 1500s, 1600s, 1700s. And we figured out what the real way of knowing stuff is. And that's science. That's empirical science. So smell, touch, taste, hearing, whatever the other one is. You see, it's only those things. We discovered this in the scientific revolution, right? This is what we discovered, is that this is the only valid way of knowing things. Of course, that's not what we discovered, but that's what this story tells you we discovered at that time. And then the story goes on a little bit later. We were still like at a loss for how to sort of like fit all that into, or fit what we knew about ourselves, given that, into this sort of materialistic picture. We were like, God, this seems right, but we just can't see how. And then Darwin showed up and we were like, oh, and that just solved the whole thing. And now here we are today. That's the story. That at one point, man was like sort of suspicious that there was more to him than meets the eye or meets the ear, right? Or meets the nose. Or see what I'm saying? There's more to him than that. Immaterial soul. The Bible talks about the flesh and the spirit, right? There's a spirit. There's something. There's what the philosophers call a seat of consciousness, right? There's a self. Okay, at one point we used to think that. But now, given that at this particular point in human history, we figured out what the one proper way of knowing stuff is, scientific method, right? More on that later. Once we knew that, then we figured out that, it turns out everything is just the kind of thing that science discovers, including us. We're just material things. So all the claims in past human history about immaterial things, not the least among them, no pun intended, God, those can just all go by the wayside because we know differently now. That's the story. An educated person, it's almost definitional of an educated person in the modern West, given the state of our universities, that someone believes something like that. Now, there's still they like to say, room made for faith. But an educated person doesn't in any way believe that the objects of faith have any intellectual standing, rational standing. And that's largely motivated, that position, I won't say it's rational itself, but the rationale for that position is largely motivated by the assumption of this story. Okay? Now, it's just a story. It's a false story. Okay? For instance, the truth is that materialism and something more than materialism, like we said a moment ago, dualism, materialism being the idea that all of reality is material, and dualism being the idea that no, all of reality is two things, not one sort of thing, but two things: mind and body, flesh and spirit, material and immaterial, right? Both of these sides, both of these positions have coexisted as long as people have been writing about these positions, right? There's always been materialists, there's always been non-materialists. Look back over the history of philosophy. So there's not like this idea of this progression, right? That's what the story has in mind. There's been this progress in knowledge, and we've discovered that materialism is true. Once we got the method down, then we discovered once we got the epistemology down, we figured out the metaphysics. Once we got the method down, we figured out the reality of reality. Okay. But maybe I don't need to say here, maybe I do need to say here. I'm going to say here again in a moment, but just please understand what I just said. Once we got the method down, this is the story. This is the logic at the core of this story that I've told you, that every educated person around you, please pay attention, because we're going to talk about people in the news making fun of you. All right? And pushing arguments past you, and you're not going to quite see how they're doing it unless you understand what their metaphysics is. I know that sounds weird, but it's true. You're not going to understand it. All right? Unless you understand what they believe philosophically, because they are not always forthright about that. Okay? You need to understand what it means to say, once we got the method right, then we discovered the reality. Or once we got the epistemology right, then we discovered. In other words, once we discovered that science was the only valid way of knowing, now we know that materialism is true. All right, or as the moderns like to say these days, now that we know that naturalism is true. Or you might say it in an unsophisticated way, now we know that atheism is true. Now that we've got the proper method, science. Why is that? Why am I dwelling on that? Because that's impossibly confused. Think of a man on a beach with a metal detector He's walking up and down the beach with the metal detector, and it keeps going, boo-doo-doo-doo-doo. You know, stop me if you've heard this one. I think I've said this before, right? He keeps going, boo-doo-doo-doo-doo, right? It goes off, and you're like, hey, man, what are you doing? He's like, I'm discovering the nature of reality. And you're like, huh? And he's like, yeah, I'm discovering the nature of reality. And you're like, all right, what is it? And he's like, it's all metal. And you're like, why do you say that? And he's like, because every time my metal detector detects something, there's metal there. And you're like, and what did you use this as evidence for again? He's like, the claim that all reality is metal. And you're like, but metal is all you can discover with that thing. And he's like, yeah, I know. Isn't it great? And you're like, no, it's not great, because your conclusion is built into your method. Right? You got to see that. And you have to understand that about these people and their background, backdrop, whatever you want to call it, behind the scenes, materialism or naturalism, as we'll call it here in a minute. Again, this is an introduction to neuropolitics. This is not the introduction to neuropolitics. Okay? So there's always been these two positions. It's not there's not been this sort of like progress that this story that all these people have imbibed consists in. Okay, it's just a story that they've imbibed. The two views have always coexisted. In fact, just to sort of shore this up, let me take you back to one of the pre-Socratic philosophers, pre-Socratic meaning prior to Socrates, who was a materialist. Okay, a pluralist, as you'll learn in the history of philosophy if you read about these guys, named Democritus. Okay, he believed that what reality was essentially little particles of stuff. Okay, little pieces. He was a pluralist. He believed the fundamental thing was all this sort of like multiplicity of pieces that came together and formed the as they say, the macroscopic world that we observe with our senses. Okay, so listen, Nick, why are you dwelling on this? Because I want you to understand what problems actually exist for the people who try to pretend that this could be true or is true, right? And I want you to understand that those problems, only one of which I'm going to mention here, are, as they might say, eternal. Like, they don't go away. They're fatal and eternal, okay? So there's problems that were discovered with materialism way back when, even though this story that these people have imbibed have made it sound like what we've progressed to is materialism from something else. It's not true. There were materialists back then, and there were problems that persist, okay? This is what you won't hear about in the story. So just as a for instance. So Democritus, is in a discussion of what it means or how it could be that, look, if you've never thought about this is a tough thing to wrap your head around, okay? Think very hard for a moment about the idea that what you're saying or someone's saying, right, is that everything in reality is composed of little pieces doing stuff. It may be, little as George Jackson Mivart said, little balls in motion. Okay, whether those things are neutrons or protons or electrons or quarks or whatever they are, okay, or atoms, whatever they are. Little balls in motion. A lot is captured by that somewhat colorful phrase. You have to appreciate that if this is really what you think the world consists in, then something really weird is happening when you think about something. Or, as a more particular example, when you perceive something, because surely when you perceive something, you think about it, right? What do I mean? Imagine yourself, and the self is going to be a huge issue. Imagine yourself standing in front of a tree, right? Or imagine a guy standing in front of a tree, looking at the tree, thinking to himself, I see this tree. If you are a materialist, then you have to hold that this whole process, from start to finish, from the tree to the seeing of it, to the mind which sees that it is being seen and says, I am me seeing this thing that I see, right? All of it, from start to finish, is material and therefore explained by, as Mivart said, little balls in motion. Now you might say, it's way more sophisticated than that. Quarks are not balls in motion. You don't understand the problem. There are problems here that appear in principle, regardless of what you posit as the smallest item, or the smallest particular, or the smallest type of physical entity, right? There's problems that that persist because they're about more than that. And these problems will appear no matter what you posit as the smallest thing. Has nothing to do with which thing you posited. It's that this sort of thing can't be explained like that. Here's what I mean. Here's Bob. And Bob's looking at a tree. He's perceiving a tree. So if you think that all of reality, and I personally, I'm just a little peek behind the curtain here. I don't think anybody really thinks this. I think people sort of deceive themselves in one way or another. But let's let's play the game. If you're going to assert and insist that all of reality is just little balls in motion, little material particles, then the you and the tree and the you seeing the tree and the you seeing that you see the tree is all little particles in motion. Okay, that's really weird. If you don't see why it's weird here, just stay on board for a minute. You're just a material thing. The tree is just a material thing. What's weird about that? Well, you have it in mind. You might say, what's weird about that? You have it in mind. Now strip the world down to just particles and their geospatial location. You have it in mind? No, you don't. It is over there. It's the tree over there. Well, then what's in your mind? You're like, oh, that's stupid. An idea's in my mind, obviously. No, it's not obvious. What the hell is an idea, and what is the assurance that the idea bears any resemblance to the object that causes it? Okay, the tree's over there, okay? But we say, but I'm thinking about it. What could that mean on a materialist picture of the universe? How could there be, look, when someone perceives something, it's in their head. So how can the tree at the same time be over there, where it is, and, because it's being thought of, in the head of this person here? In other words, it can't, obviously. So what is it that's in their head? In fact, if all we have is brain particles moving around and zapping and buzzing and neurons and things like that, fizzing, whatever we take the smallest part, right? If all we have is that, what could it even mean to say that the tree over there is perceived or thought about? You say, well, it's because he's thinking of it. He has it in mind. No, it's over there. What is this thing he has in mind? And what is the connection between it and some other object in the external world? Listen. Democritus was like, yeah, we should probably consider that. And Democritus and his followers say, well, yeah, how could the external world even be perceived? What could that consist in? Let's take that tree. Here's what they said. The tree over there gives off, let's use a descriptive word here. The tree emanates, like right? The tree emanates little images of itself. And those images travel through the air. I guess they're images that are made up of little particles that are, what are they, in the shape of the tree? Like, what? No, it sounds like I'm asking a nonsense question. It's a very important question. Hold on a second, though. It emanates little images of itself, and those images impinge on, as they say, or impress themselves upon the mind of the observer. That's what perception is. Okay, how do they do that? Well, they make their way into the eye, into the optic nerve, and then impress themselves and code themselves somehow, I don't know, on the brain, right? And that's what it means to see the tree. Okay. Well, here's what Democritus and his students said. And they were materialists. They said, or here's the consequence of what they're saying, right? And this is why they're having the discussion, right? Because it's not obviously clear how this happens. You say the tree gives off an image of itself. You say, well, why did we start this whole process of reasoning in the first place? What were we trying to uncover? What were we trying to discover? What were we trying to analyze? Oh, thinking, perceiving. Okay. So we came out with an answer that says thinking and perceiving is explained by And then we use this concept of an image in the explanation. But look, an image is a thing that requires an observer to be what it is. It's what the philosophers call a mind relative entity. So we have used a mind relative entity to explain the nature of the mind, or the fundamental act of mind, which like perception, right? We've used a mind relative entity to, in other words, we've used thinking to explain thinking. We've used perception to explain perception. We've just gone in a circle. We haven't explained a damn thing. Okay? I mean, if as crazy as it sounds, these little images are being given off of this thing and they're floating towards my head. My head's just another physical thing that itself is giving off images of itself to other people looking at me, right? If that's what's happening, well, an image is a thing that can only be understood by a perceiver. So you've just smuggled in the concept of perception into your explanation of perception. So that thing's still got to be perceived. Okay? There's a deeper problem here. I know, as deep as it sounds surprising because a circularity problem is about as deep as it gets. It's all encompassing, right? But there's a deeper problem here. Let's suppose that these images are being given off, right? And these images somehow impress themselves upon the mind, or the seat of consciousness, as the philosophers say, of the perceiver. But these images, mind you, whatever an image in this context means, are just little groupings of particles that are being given off by the object in question. Okay? So when they leave that object, let's say it's a tree, how do they know to stay in the shape of a tree? You might say, what kind of question is that? No, it's a very, very, very important question, because it's a question about whether the particles themselves are under some sort of governance of the concept that we're saying they ground the knowledge of. And I will tell you, this is a lot for a first episode, I'm very sorry. I will tell you that when you get to the bottom of this problem, it is absolutely intractable. There have been philosophers throughout the history of philosophy that sort of anticipated the issue, but it has come to the forefront in the philosophy of mind in the past 30, 40 years, and it's intractable. It's intractable. Okay. And I will say this is a series here, so I'll say more about that. I promise there'll be a whole episode that is like just devoted, maybe even several, towards that problem. But I'm just giving you a preview. It's intractable. You can't do it. You can't explain how the little group of particles traveling from the tree know, we should stay in the shape of a tree so that the person perceiving us knows that it's a tree that he's seeing. It's inexplicable, right? Obviously, the concept, if we're saying all concepts arrive as a result of physical activity, we can't then say that the activity of the physical stuff is governed by the concept. So there's no insurance. There's no epistemic insurance from the object to the mind perceiving it. Okay? Much more on that later. I talked about the story. I've sort of alluded to what we're going to say going forward. There's more to say about this. But why I said there's two reasons. Look, our media class, the people who report the news to you and tell you what's important to think about and what's not, and what you should care about and what you should. Our media class has been educated in an environment where this story that I've alluded to a moment ago has just been assumed. In other words, it's just been assumed that materialism, or what we'll call naturalism a little bit later, they don't call it anything because they see it as the ipso facto. They see it as the given. It's like a fish in water. They're like, it's not wet. I'm not wet. I'm in my world, right? They don't call it anything, but you have to call it something, unless you're just going to, unflinchingly, unabashedly just assume all their assumptions. You have to see it for what it is before you go along with it. Okay? They've been raised, they've been educated, they've been brought up in this environment where this story that materialism has somehow been given to us by science, and the two are sort of like validate each other, right? That this is true. And everything they have to say about Darwin, and everything they have to say about climate change, and everything they have to say about gender, and everything all these things follow from that. That's their thing, right? And people want to have these superficial discussions about those other things. There's no point to do that. You have to address the thing that is creating all these positions for them, and it's the materialism, or the naturalism. I'll explain these terms in a minute. Okay? Maybe I shouldn't say what I'm saying right now the way I'm saying it without having explained a little bit more, but there's going to be, again, this is an introduction to neuropolitics. And in the next episode, an introduction to neuropolitics, we're going to touch heavily in 50% of the show on what naturalism is and why I'm gesticulating and gesturing so vividly right now, folks watching on YouTube. All right, their demographic, they have just imbibed what we've here identified as simply a story. They've imbibed it. It's the truth. It's the gospel to them. Okay, never mind. It's a profound misunderstanding of intellectual history. It's also a profound misunderstanding of the concepts at play in that history, right? It's that it's the fact that they believe it, okay? It's the fact that they believe it, okay? And the fact that they believe it, I said a moment ago, we're going to come to the second reason for discussing it. Here's the reason: because they use it to advance their views. They use this story to advance their social, their political, their moral views. All their views. This thing plays a role. I'm going to argue, you'll see in a minute, it plays a fundamental role. But if you can't see it for what it is, then you can't argue with that. You can't compete, right? Because it's often the thing that's doing the work, right? So if you just let it go by, you've missed the train. You've missed the forest for the trees. All right. So they use this narrative in one way or another to advance their causes. How do they do this? Well, essentially they do it by arguing, to the extent that they argue at all, more on that in a minute, that they argue their positions on the basis of naturalism. It is like the fulcrum, it's the lever, but it's kind of invisible unless you understand what it is and you understand a little bit about to what use they put it. Okay? It's just that they call it, and this is part of the game, they call it science. Okay? Instead of calling it naturalism. Why wouldn't they call it naturalism? Because they don't see a difference between the two, right? Naturalism to them is like reality. So why would you give it a name? It's just what's obviously true, okay? But they purposefully distort and confuse science and naturalism, okay? They're the guy on the beach with the metal detector saying the whole universe is made of metal because that's all they're detecting, okay? See? So they argue for materialism by simply assuming materialism, which amounts to saying that they argue for materialism by assuming materialism. See? All right, think about this for a second. Socialism, yes, listen. Socialism takes as a foundational assumption that there is a finite store of material resources on the earth, and that humans are no more than material entities themselves vying for access to those resources, and that this necessarily this situation results in oppression unless the government owns absolutely everything and comes in and doles it out to those who behave properly. Okay, that was sort of shorthand, right? I got a little bit colorful, but it's true. Just listen to the first part. Socialism takes as a foundational assumption materialism. What does that mean? Well, the world is material. Humans are material. Their needs are material. And material resources are material and limited, right? And here it comes. Please pay attention. And since the world is only material, there are certainly no immaterial things like universal laws, like human rights, like the right to property, which would bar us from confiscating all your stuff and then wisely rationing it out. Socialism begins with materialism. Why are we saying this? I'm trying to brace you for to understand the relationship between the hard sciences, because I know lately all the rage is like the humanities, and I talked about this in Unmasking Antifa. All the rage is like the humanities, and all the discussion about the Marxism going on in postmodern philosophy, right? It's in the hard sciences too. Or it's not in the hard sciences, it's in the academic discussions of the hard sciences, which take place in the philosophy of science, okay? But it's done differently there, and I'm trying to wade you into that. It's very important. I'm trying to understand what role the hard sciences play in advancing socialism in America, but you have to see their affinity first. Okay? The hard sciences study material. The socialist says everything is material. The socialist makes the scientist the arbiter of all reality in return for the favor of fallaciously lending to socialism the esteem earned by the hard sciences. Socialism didn't earn that. It's not earned its wings. It's not demonstrated itself. There's no right. It hasn't. In fact, it on paper it doesn't work, right? But this is the trade-off. This is the sort of like in the room. This is how the sausage gets This is the trade-off. This is the handshake. Okay? It is said to the public that socialism is verified by the hard sciences. So socialism gets the badge, the credentials, okay, of the hard sciences to facilitate socialism. But how? Because you just implicitly associate in your audience the truth, right, between your speculative social claims, right, on the one hand, and the body of science that we all know is successful on the other. And you're like, well, if you don't believe this, it must be because you're anti this, right? If you don't believe our theories, you must be anti-science, right? Never mind that there's no connection between the two. It's just been done as a sort of favor, okay? I read this once. Listen. I read this once in Unmasking Antifa. I want to read it again. This is a quote. I'm reading this because we're talking about the way socialism moves into a society, and I'm here in this series, sort of like drawing your attention to a route I don't think you might be mindful of. Okay, so I got to sort of shore this up a little bit, and I've used this quote, this piece of evidence, this exhibit, whatever you want to call it. I've used it before, and it's relevant here again because the discussion that's being had in this 1908 Socialist Party of America convention intramural debate, the discussion that's being had is whether socialists should advance their cause by convincing people first of atheism and then of socialism, or convincing people first of socialism and then convincing them of atheism. It's interesting that this is even a discussion, right? I mean, it's just assumed that the two go hand in hand. The only question is, well, which way should we ease people into it? And one of the gentlemen at the convention responds this way to that intramural debate. He says, would you expect to go out among the peoples of this country, people of different churches, of so many religious factions, and tell them that they must first become atheists before they can become socialists? That would be nonsense. We must first get these men convinced of the reality of our economic and political program, and then after that, after we have made socialists of them and members of the Socialist Party, we can talk to them. Then, in other words, after that, we can talk to them inside our ranks. About what? Talk to them of the higher philosophy and of the logical consequences of our explanation of society and nature. That is a packed last statement. But what we're going to get into in the next episode, is about the logical consequences of their idea or their explanation of society and nature. We're going to talk a lot about those things, and one of the headings under which we're going to talk about it is naturalism, because naturalism is their idea, right, of the logical consequences of society and nature, or rather naturalism for them creates those consequences. So we're going to have a lot to say about that. All right. This is the world that our media is brought up in. So when you wonder to yourself why they seem like your enemy, when you wonder why they lie incessantly, well, it's because they've been indoctrinated, okay? They have this view on the world, and it's got to be addressed. Okay? But what? What? What does it have to do with the mind? If you want to fundamentally change a society on a large scale, you're either going to do it by force or you're not, right? Doing it by force is bloody. If you're going to do it without force, notice what you kind of have to do. You kind of have to get the thing to do it to itself, okay? So how are you going to get the public to radically alter itself? Well, to do that, you have to change what its conception of itself is, okay? You have to make people come to think that they are something different than they had formerly thought that they were, and suggest that now that this thing has been corrected, now that their view about this thing has been corrected, well, now society and all these other things need to change in accordance with this new truth about what we now know we are. See, just like he said in that quote, first convince them of socialism and its sort of immediate implications, and then sort of warm them up to the consequences for all their other beliefs, right? You have to get people to change their beliefs about what they are. Okay? Well, what are they? What are we? Well, we're selves. Well, what's a self? Oh, turns out a self is kind of like a thing with a mind. Well, what's a mind? That's what you have to change their minds about. Okay? Up until a certain point in history, and for a long time, residually in America, there has been this notion of what the mind is that is very much ancient, according to these lines. It's Judeo-Christian. It's right. It's metaphysically robust. Humans are selves, their minds, their souls. This dualistic picture of humanity and what the world is has been largely held. Okay, so you got to change that. You got to make people think they're merely material. So a self is merely material. Okay, you've got to focus on the mind, because the mind is what people take themselves to be. So you've got to change what they think about what that thing is. Okay. Then they'll accept a reorganization of the world they live in, because their self-conception has been reorganized. Okay? And there's certain consequences for how the world should be, given what we're here saying the person is. Person is just these bundle of physical needs, because all a person is a physical thing. So let's reorganize society. Okay, when we come back, here's how we're going to do this. We're going to analyze this clip. I keep holding in the background here. I guess... Look, there it is. Wait. There it is. I think we got to it partially last episode. We're going to analyze this clip at 3 levels, okay? Just because, well, I guess if you're on YouTube, there's 3 levels to this, because there's one visual level, but it's not important here if you're not watching video. There's just kind of one aspect to this that's fun to point out visually. But here's the 3 levels at which we're going to analyze this. The first is the factual claims, just what's stated, or I should say what's stated and left unstated implicitly, right? Just the facts. Okay, we're going to look at a little bit. There's also a second level that I'm going to call the proposal, right? What ought to be done about the facts, right? This is where it gets really interesting, because this is where, despite there being a panel of liberals, or as I'm going to argue here in the next episode, naturalists, okay, there's some tension centering around the proposal. Despite their attempt to all be on the same team, there is some difference, and it's interesting to note as far as what the proposal is. It comes out most boldly there. It also comes out at the 3rd level that we're going to analyze, which is body language. And again, this is sort of just, it's not hugely consequential, but it's entertaining to watch once you understand what all these people on this panel are on about. And you will once we get into it in the next episode. So in that next episode, which is going to be called An Introduction to Neuropolitics, we're going to talk about 2 things. We're going to talk about naturalism, and then I'm going to explain what neuropolitics is in a way that probably no one's ever explained it, but I think it's super useful and obviously true. So I'll see you in episode 53, or I'll see you in the next video, or whatever you want to call it. Until then.